It's that time of the week when we're joined by Stephanie Dobson. Stephanie is a lawyer, mediator, and online educator with Hankett Divorce Law and Mediation, offices in Edmonton and Lloydminster. Stephanie, thank you once again for joining me.
Nice to see you as always, Stacey.
This week, we're going to be talking about prenuptial agreements, something that can be very contentious even when they're organized perfectly. So let's start out by talking about what exactly is a prenuptial agreement.
Yeah, Stacey, I thought this would be a good topic because, of course, we're just past Valentine's Day and there's lots of people who have just maybe got engaged or just gotten married around that time, this time of the year. In Canada, discussions around marriage often bring up the notion of a prenuptial agreement, and these are often referred to as, we call them prenups. They can obviously be viewed quite negatively by a lot of people. People that I see in my office, we often don't see prenuptial agreements having been entered into, but they can really serve as a practical tool to help both parties in the event of a separation and divorce. So what is a prenup? A prenup is a legally binding contract that's entered into by a couple prior to when they get married. Now, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, we have kind of technical names for them, but in fact, it's just a contract, and it can be entered into technically before you get married, but it can also be entered into after the date of marriage. So if you're already married, it doesn't mean that you're exempt from being eligible to enter into a prenuptial agreement.
And what would be the purpose of having a prenup, Stephanie?
There's lots of different purposes for prenups. So I thought of 4 here for us to talk about today. So number 1 is what I think people mostly think about. Well, number 1 and 2, I guess, is what people mostly think about is asset protection. So if you have a significant disparity between your asset levels, a lot of times people will want to protect their assets, and they'll also want to set out the responsibility for debt. So who will be servicing what debts in the event of a separation? You might also want to talk about inheritance rights. So in the event of not just separation, but in the event of death, during a relationship, what will happen with those assets and debts? And then it can also go beyond that into clarifying some expectations. So, for example, what are some of the financial expectations of each spouse during the marriage? What are some of the parenting expectations of each spouse during the marriage? So it can go beyond just the asset and debt protection.
And now, what about the legal framework with a prenup? Can you tell me a little bit about that, Stephanie?
Well, it is certainly important if you're going to enter into a prenup, we want to make sure that these prenups are actually enforceable. So there's some legal requirements that you have. One is that the agreement has to be in writing and signed by both parties, and each of you should also obtain what's called independent legal advice. That's a certificate that's signed at the end of the contract where the lawyer signs off on that certificate of independent legal advice. It also requires full disclosure. So that's where both of you need to make sure that you've provided that all of your documentation relating to that asset base and the debts that you've got. It has to be fair. So fair at the time of signing. So an agreement that's what's called unconscionable or heavily biased towards one party may not be enforceable.
And how does it get negotiated?
Well, just like we talk a lot in our other episodes about mediation and collaborative law, prenups and interspousal agreements can also be negotiated using collaborative law and mediation. So these agreements can be especially tough because what you're wanting to do is to protect yourself, but also to preserve the relationship. Of course, you're still in the relationship when you're negotiating these things. So it's really important that we choose processes like mediation and collaborative law to continue that relationship.
What would a benefit or some of the benefits be to having a prenup in place?
Well, I would say that the biggest benefit is peace of mind, because you're in the relationship, you're going about your time during the relationship, and it's really important to make sure that you feel secure in, if you're increasing the value of a particular asset or a company, or you're increasing your debt load. A lot of times people want to be sure of, if in the event of separation, what will happen with that particular asset and debt. Open communication is another really good benefit. Some of these conversations, especially in mediation, when we're talking, it really sparks some important discussions around finances and expectations within the marriage that you often wouldn't otherwise have.
All right, Stephanie. Well, thank you so much for joining me once again, and we'll be back to chat with you again next week.
Sounds good. Thanks, Stacey.